I want to start this evening by thanking you once again for coming out here on a dark and rainy night, as if going to see a noir film on a dark and rainy night wouldn't be the most appropriate thing to do. Talk a little bit before we start tonight's screening of Double Indemnity about some of the ideas that critics have thrown out about film noir. And one of the first questions people have asked was, what is it? Is it really a genre? Is it really something like the Western, like the romantic comedy? And if you've seen the previous films screened here, or might be a cinephile who's seen a lot of film noir films, the obvious answer is not quite really. They're thematically diverse, and what holds them together, or what made the films called film noir, was that they seem to be black, both in terms of subject matter and in terms of visual style. And it's really the French critics and French audiences who saw these films back to back after the war, who noticed that they had this both these kind of thematic motifs, but also the visual style in common. So above and beyond them also kind of picking up on the hard-boiled detective novel tradition and adapting that to the cinema, there were a number of other influences that I think are important there. One of them is that a lot of the noir directors, and tonight's director, Billy Wilder, is Austrian-born. He lived in Berlin until 1933, when he emigrated as a Jewish screenwriter to the United States via Paris. And so he had to leave Germany and came to the United States. And so he's one of the many émigré directors who directed noir films, an essentially American genre indebted to the hard-boiled detective novel. So there is a kind of cross-national or transnational influence there, particularly in relationship to visual style, because Wilder and other directors like him, and Fritz Lang, Robert Siodmak, Otto Preminger come to mind, had grown up watching German expressionist cinema, which was also very much interested in a kind of almost painterly chiaroscuro black and white aesthetic. And they imported that and adapted that to these film noirs. The French poetic realist tradition is also one that is cited as an influence on these particular films. But they also kind of mark a particular historical period, which is one we talked before the screening briefly about maybe speaking to post-traumatic stress disorder in returning American soldiers. But noir really starts in the early 40s, and it could also speak to the émigré experience of living through the 30s. And the traumas that the 30s bring for these foreign directors, which leads them or brings them to coming to the United States in the first place. So you have a lot, there's a lot of disillusionment going on in these films, a lot of cynical, world-weary people. That might be a response there to this kind of social and political environment, even though that might not be referenced directly in the films at all. Another topic that comes up a lot is that, even though the women in film noir are often very evil, they're also very powerful, which probably means that they need to be killed off by the narrative at the end of the story. So there is this, and that has often been discussed as perhaps a response. These are male writers, male directors making these films as response to anxiety surrounding the role of the modern woman, particularly to the role of women who were becoming very strong as their husbands, fathers, or whomever was gone off to the war. So that there is a kind of nod to the fact that the role of women is changing, while there's also a kind of anxiety surrounding that, a kind of masculinity in crisis, if you will, that kind of emerges in these types of stories. A few more words on Double Indemnity itself. It was actually based on, and I need to take this different notepad. It's actually based on a James M. Cain novella, which he published in 1935. It's a serial in a magazine called Liberty, and that was very successful. He was actually a kind of crime reporter. He had attended a trial in 1927 of a Queens woman and her lover who were tried and convicted for killing the woman's husband. And so he transposed this into a novel, and then all the studios were starting to think about ways of adapting that for the screen. And one of the things that was difficult to do at the time was that you had to contend with the Hays Office and the production code of 1934, which really was a way of self-censoring provocative material in Hollywood, so there wouldn't be official censorship that legislated. And so they submitted the script and the idea, and I just wanted to read out the quote of the Breen office, what they thought about it. And they thought, this is after Paramount, they were competing for it. And the letter came out from Joseph Breen at the Hays office, and it said, "In the general low tone and sordid flavor of this story makes it, in our judgment, thoroughly unacceptable for screen presentation before mixed audiences in the theater. I am sure you will agree that this is most important to avoid what the code calls hardening the audiences, especially those who are young and impressionable to the thought and fact of crime." Now, not heeding these warnings, the film was made nonetheless. It kind of struggled with the Hays office along the way. When it came out, it was a huge success. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards. It didn't win any of them. But I think it's one of the most beloved classics, and what I particularly enjoy about it is the lighting with the Venetian blinds. If the Venetian blinds in Film Noir cut you up visually, I think you might be in for it later on in the story. And with that, I think we can get started.